My name is Madeline Harper, and for 2 years I was a ghost. On the grand stage of the International Neuroscience Symposium, under lights so bright they felt like a sterile sun, I made my return. I looked out at the sea of faces, 1,000 of the brightest minds in medicine, and my gaze found him in the front row. Dr. Alastair Finch, my former mentor. A titan of the industry, looking at me with the same placid, paternal smile he wore the day he destroyed my life. He thought I was an opening act, a minor researcher from some insignificant startup. He had no idea I was the main event. I stepped closer to the microphone. The silence in the massive auditorium was a physical presence. For the past 2 years, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified to fill every corner of the room. Our industry has chased a ghost, a miracle drug for Alzheimer's that promised to change the world. Today, we're going to turn on the lights. From the front row, I saw Alastair's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. His company, Viridian Dynamics, was on the cusp of final FDA approval for that very drug. He thought this was his coronation. He didn't know it was his eulogy. Seeing him there, basking in a glory he had stolen, it all came rushing back. The sterile scent of the laboratory that had been my sanctuary. The gut-wrenching moment my world had been pulled out from under me. 2 years earlier. The lab at Viridian Dynamics was my universe. A symphony of humming freezers, clicking centrifuges, and the quiet, focused energy of discovery. I was on the verge of a breakthrough, a compound designated AD-117 that had shown an unprecedented ability to slow cognitive decay in our preclinical models. It was my life's work, the culmination of a decade of relentless effort. Alastair Finch had been my champion since my doctoral studies. He'd recruited me, guided me, and his praise was the currency I valued most. The summons came via a terse email on a Tuesday morning. Subject: urgent data review. The walk to his corner office felt different. The usual friendly nods from colleagues were replaced with quick, averted gazes or tight, pitying smiles. They knew. In the hyper-competitive ecosystem of biotech research, the scent of a kill travels fast. Alastair was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his hands steepled under his chin, his expression a carefully composed mask of profound disappointment. "Madeline," he began, his voice laced with a counterfeit sorrow that was more insulting than outright cruelty. "We have a problem, a serious one." I sat down, the leather of the chair cold against my skin. I waited. "There are inconsistencies in your latest data set for AD-117, he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Significant violations of our research ethics protocols. It appears the data has been manipulated to produce a more favorable outcome." The words didn't compute. It was like he was speaking a foreign language. Manipulated? My data was my religion. Its integrity was absolute. I had spent sleepless nights triple-checking every data point, every control group. "That's impossible," I said, my own voice sounding distant. "My logs are meticulous. Every experiment is fully documented and reproducible." "That's what makes this so disappointing," he sighed, shaking his head slowly. "The craft is excellent, but the foundation is flawed. I can't in good conscience allow this project to move forward based on compromised science." It was then that I saw it, the flicker of something cold and triumphant in his eyes. This wasn't about ethics. This was a coup. 2 weeks earlier, I had refused his suggestion to bypass a 6-month longitudinal stability test on the compound. He had called it an unnecessary delay. I had called it essential for patient safety. This was my punishment for insubordination. He wasn't just sidelining me, he was seizing my work. "I don't understand," I whispered, the floor dropping out from beneath me. "Alastair, this is my entire life. And as your mentor, it is my painful duty to protect this institution and the scientific community from faulty research," he said, his tone shifting from sorrowful to surgical. "Your employment with Viridian Dynamics is terminated, effective immediately." The shock was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My career, my reputation, my future, all erased in a single sentence. My mind raced, trying to grasp for a lifeline. "A reference," I managed to say, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. "I'll need you to confirm my work on the preliminary compounds. Without your validation—" He held up a hand, stopping me. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Based on this, Madeline, I cannot validate anything. In fact, I have an ethical obligation to be transparent if I'm asked. I have to warn the community." It was a threat, delivered with the placid smile of an executioner. "Stay quiet, or I will not just fire you. I will salt the earth of your career so that nothing can ever grow there again." The final humiliation was a blur, being escorted from my own lab by security, packing my notebooks and a small framed photo into a cardboard box. The silent, hulking guard ensuring I didn't steal the intellectual property that was already being stolen from me. As I walked through the glass doors of the building for the last time, I was no longer a brilliant young scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. I was a pariah, a cautionary tale. The first few weeks were a fog of disbelief and grief, but I was a fighter. I polished my resume, omitting my final project at Veridian, and began reaching out to my network. I started applying for positions at other major pharmaceutical companies and top-tier research institutes. Then the silence began. It was a peculiar and terrifying kind of silence. I would have fantastic initial interviews. My publication record was stellar, my expertise undeniable. Recruiters were enthusiastic. I would get to the final stages, the part where they conduct academic and professional reference checks. And then nothing. Emails went unanswered. Calls were not returned. A week or two later, I'd receive a polite, form letter rejection. We've decided to pursue other candidates whose experience more closely matches our needs. It happened once, twice, 10 times, 12 times in 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. A wall of silence would descend at the exact same point in the process. Something was actively working against me. The truth arrived not in a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet digital accident on a rainy Thursday afternoon. It came from a kind, elderly professor at a university I had applied to, a man who had known me since I was an undergrad. He was on the hiring committee and had been baffled by my sudden removal from the shortlist. He did some digging. He forwarded me an email chain with a simple note: "Madeline, I thought you deserved to see this. I am so sorry." The email was from the head of the search committee. It detailed a summary of an informal, off-the-record conversation he'd had with Dr. Alastair Finch. The words burned into my retinas. Alastair had expressed his deep personal disappointment and grave concerns regarding Ms. Harper's methodological integrity. He mentioned no official findings, no formal charges. He didn't have to. In the coded language of academia, concerns about integrity was a kill shot. It was a black mark, a poison pill whispered from one trusted colleague to another. It screamed, "Do not hire this person. There's a problem here we cannot legally tell you about." I stared at the screen, the room growing cold around me. It all made sense. The ghosting, the rejections. Alastair hadn't just fired me, he hadn't just stolen my work. He was methodically, systematically poisoning every well I tried to drink from. He was ensuring I would be cast out into the wilderness, silenced forever, unable to ever challenge his claim to my discovery. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clarifying rage. It wasn't a hot, blinding anger, but a slow-burning, icy fury that sharpened my thoughts and steadied my hands. The humiliation I felt walking out of that office now seemed trivial. This was a calculated act of professional annihilation. For the rest of that evening, I didn't move from my chair. I didn't eat. I didn't answer my phone. Instead, I opened a new browser window. I bought a subscription to a secure, encrypted cloud storage service. I purchased a new, high-capacity external hard drive. And then I began to dig. I still had access to my personal email archives, my backups on old laptops, my meticulous personal notes. I started to systematically gather every digital trace of my work at Veridian, every raw data file I had emailed to myself to work on from home, every draft of every research paper, every email thread where I had documented my processes. Most importantly, I found the complete email chain about the longitudinal stability tests, my detailed, time-stamped warnings about the risks of skipping the protocol, and his final, dismissive reply: "Maddie, your caution is admirable but unnecessary. We need to prioritize speed to market. Proceed with the expedited timeline. This is a directive." I downloaded and cataloged everything, cross-referencing dates, times, and metadata. I was creating a secret, unassailable archive of the truth, a shadow ledger of my own competence and his deliberate, reckless malfeasance. It was my intellectual property, the product of my mind and my labor, and his fingerprints of approval were on all of it, right up until the moment he chose to erase mine. As the sun began to rise, casting a gray light into my apartment, I had amassed a formidable collection. It was an arsenal. I didn't know yet how I would use it or when, but I knew it was the only thing of value I had left. I closed my laptop. I walked over to the small whiteboard in my study, the one I used for mapping out molecular structures. I erased it clean. Then, with a black marker, I wrote a single, quiet sentence. It wasn't a plan. It was a promise. If he buries the truth, I will build the laboratory to excavate it. The ghost had a new mission. The 2 years that followed were a lesson in professional erasure. The incandescent rage of that first night had to be banked, not extinguished, but cooled into a low-glowing coal, waiting for oxygen. I survived in the wilderness of the gig economy, a place where so many professionally wounded soldiers end up. I became a ghost, a freelance data integrity consultant. My name, Madeline Harper, once destined for the cover of prestigious journals, was now attached to short-term contracts and invoices paid 30 days late. I took on the small, unglamorous projects the big firms wouldn't touch, verifying clinical trial data for startups that would burn out in 6 months. It was anonymous, unfulfilling work, but it paid the rent. And it kept me in the game, observing the currents of the industry from the shoreline while Alastair Finch sailed his corporate battleship in the deep water. My connection to Ethelred Therapeutics began with a 3-week contract. They found me on a freelance platform, a name on a list with a 5-star rating for attention to detail. Ethelred was everything Viridian was not: small, scrappy, and perpetually chaotic. Their office was a converted warehouse in a part of the city still trying to be trendy, with exposed brick walls, a communal cold brew tap, and a palpable energy of ambition that often outpaced their actual capabilities. My task was simple: perform a third-party audit of their data package before they submitted it to a venture capital firm. But as I delved into their raw data, I saw more than just spreadsheet errors. I saw a fundamental structural flaw in their methodology, a subtle but persistent bias in their sample collection that would invalidate their entire conclusion. They were brilliant biochemists, but they were amateurs when it came to the labyrinthine bureaucracy of clinical data standards. They were about to ask for $50 million based on a house of cards. I watched them for a week, listening to their strategy sessions, noting the gaps in their knowledge. One afternoon, I overheard their founder, a dynamic Silicon Valley transplant named Julian Croft, arguing with his lead scientist. Julian was a creature of pure data, a brilliant strategist with a complete inability to suffer fools. He had never heard of Viridian dynamics, and he certainly had never heard of the academic gossip surrounding me. To him, I was just the auditor. I waited until he was alone, grabbing a coffee. "Your cohort selection protocol is creating a confirmation bias," I said quietly, holding my own mug. He looked at me, surprised I had spoken. "Your efficacy numbers look amazing, but they won't survive a formal peer review, let alone an FDA audit. The flaw is here," I said, pointing to a specific line in a printout I was holding. "You're unintentionally screening out non-responders at stage 2. Julian stared at me, his frantic energy pausing for a moment. "How do you know that?" None of my people caught it. "I used to specialize in trial design for neurodegenerative compounds at a large firm," I said, keeping my tone even. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. I left after a major restructuring to pursue a more flexible consulting career. It was a clean, believable narrative that raised no red flags. Julian took my advice. They spent the next month rerunning the analysis based on my input. Their impressive efficacy numbers dropped by 30%. But the data was now sound. It was real. They secured their funding. A week later, Julian called me into his office. He slid a contract across the table. It wasn't for a freelance gig. The title read, Head of Research Integrity and Strategy. "I don't care what you did before," he said, his gaze direct. "I care what you can do for us now. I'm not building a company that takes shortcuts. I need someone to build our foundation out of bedrock. That's you." And just like that, I was back. Not in the gleaming towers of a pharma giant, but I was in the room where decisions were made. The pilot light inside me burned a little brighter. The opportunity I had been waiting for, the one I hadn't even let myself fully hope for, arrived on a cold Monday in October. It came in the form of a government press release. The FDA was officially opening a fast-track designation for a new class of Alzheimer's drugs. It was the Super Bowl of pharmaceutical development. Every major player would be vying for it. As the news alert flashed on my monitor, I felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline so potent it was almost painful. My first immediate thought was not about Ethelred. It was about Viridian. This was their territory, and at the top of the list of likely candidates for the designation was their flagship compound, AD-117. My compound. I spent the next 48 hours buried in public patent filings and preliminary data releases. I found what I was looking for late on the second night. It was a copy of Veridian's presentation from an investor conference. As I scrolled through the slides, a chilling sense of déjà vu washed over me. I was looking at my own work. The molecular diagrams, the mechanism of action, the predicted efficacy curves. It was all mine. They had repurposed my intellectual property, my strategic DNA, and had been winning with it ever since. I saw my ghost in every chart, and then I saw the flaw. A tiny detail, a specific data point in the long-term stability results that I had always insisted on, but that Alistair had seen as overly cautious. It was a vulnerability he wouldn't understand because he had never respected the intricate details of the science, only the glory of the results. He had taken my engine but thrown out the most important safety gauge. That evening, the Ethelred leadership team gathered. The mood was grim. Veridian's AD-117 was a fortress, seemingly unbeatable. "We can't compete with their resources or their head start," their lead scientist said, deflated. I waited for a lull in the conversation. Then I stood up. "They're going to lose," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Every eye in the room turned to me. "In fact, any company that follows the standard submission model is going to lose." Julian crossed his arms. "That's a bold statement, Madeline. Veridian's strategy, which everyone here is trying to emulate, is built on a foundation that is about to become a liability," I explained. "And I know that because I'm the one who built it." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I can design a submission that doesn't just compete with theirs. I can design a submission that uses the FDA's own regulatory framework to make our competitors disqualify themselves. The key wasn't a smoking gun. It was a ghost in the machine of pharmaceutical law, an obscure subsection in the FDA's guidelines. It was called Section 4B, Long-Term Stability and Degradant Analysis. It was an elegant and deadly predator. I spread the printouts of the new fast-track RFP across the conference room table. "Forget their resources, their manpower, their reputation," I began. "All of it is irrelevant. We are going to focus our entire strategy on one single principle: absolute, unimpeachable transparency. Transparency doesn't win an FDA approval, Madeline," Julian countered. "Superior data does. Normally, you'd be right," I conceded. "But this isn't a normal submission. Look here." I pointed to a paragraph buried on page 87 of the RFP. Section 4B, it stipulated that for any new neurodegenerative compound, bidders were required to provide a full, unredacted, 24-month analysis of the compound's chemical stability, specifically identifying any and all degradant compounds that emerge over time. Failure to do so, or any inconsistency in the data, would result in immediate disqualification. The rule was designed to prevent a drug from being approved that might break down into something toxic inside the human body over time. "Okay," Julian said, looking up. "It's a safety clause, standard stuff. How does this help us?" This was the moment, the reveal. "Because 2.5 years ago," I said, meeting his gaze, "I was the lead researcher on the project that became AD-117. I wrote the original stability testing protocol for it. My protocol included a mandatory 24-month observation period to identify a specific, theoretical degradant I was concerned about." I took a deep breath. My directive was overridden by my superior. He deemed it an unnecessary delay. The tests were cut short at 18 months to expedite the path to human trials. The implications settled over the room like a layer of dust. "He cut a corner," Julian said, his eyes wide. "He cut a corner that I specifically warned him in writing not to cut," I corrected. "He is counting on the fact that no one will have the time or the inclination to cross-reference this massive submission with a minor protocol deviation from 2 years ago. And he'd be right, except for one thing." I reached into my bag and pulled out the slim black hard drive. I held it up. It felt impossibly heavy in my hand. "I kept a copy of my original protocol," I said softly. "The one with my digital signature and a time-stamped metadata trail. I have the memo where I warned him of the potential risks, and I have his signed, digital directive overriding me. I have the original, and I have the lie." A slow, predatory grin spread across Julian's face. "So, we expose them." "No," I said immediately. "That's not how this works. If we make a direct accusation, it's my word against a titan of the industry. They'll bury us in legal fees and paint me as a bitter ex-employee. We don't throw the rock. We build a wall so strong that when they throw their rock, it bounces back and hits them in the face." And so the work began. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't just lead the Ethelred team. I re-educated them. We didn't focus on our own drug's potential. We focused on building what I called the verdict protocol. It was the first 20 pages of our submission, a section no one usually paid much attention to. I turned it into our primary weapon. I drilled them relentlessly on the exact, literal language of the FDA regulations. Where Viridian's submission would be vague, we would be specific. Where they would use glossy marketing language, we would cite the specific subsection of the code we were satisfying. We were creating a document so rigorously, almost painfully, honest that it would make any other submission look lazy and deceptive by comparison. We weren't just following the rules. We were turning the rule book into a moral treatise. They thought they were learning how to write an FDA submission. I was teaching them how to build a guillotine. The final piece, the blade itself, was a single footnote. I added it late one night. It was attached to the heading of our stability data section. The footnote read, "In accordance with best practices for 21 CFR Part 314, bidders are directed to Appendix D of this proposal for a detailed checklist on certifying long-term compound integrity. This includes specific guidelines for identifying and quantifying nascent degradants." It looked harmless, but Appendix D was the trap. It was a checklist I had created, a document that didn't just restate the rules, but interpreted them in the most stringent, literal way possible. It was a direct reflection of the original memo I had written at Viridian, the one Alastair had ignored and buried. When the FDA review committee read our submission, they would see Appendix D as a gold standard of due diligence. And when Alastair and his team read it, as all competing firms were entitled to do, they would see their own ghost. They would be forced into an impossible position: either withdraw their bid, a public humiliation, or hope the committee didn't notice their 18-month data didn't meet the 24-month standard my protocol had now established as best practice. And I knew Alastair. His arrogance wouldn't let him withdraw. He would double down. The team gathered for a final review. The air was thick with tension. "It's a beautiful trap, Madeline," Julian said, his voice low, "but it only works if they walk into it. Are you absolutely certain Finch won't just see this, realize he's cornered, and file a correction?" The entire room looked at me. "Certain," I said, without hesitation. I didn't tell them that for years I had a front row seat to Alastair Finch's psyche. He wouldn't see this as a scientific issue to be corrected. He would see it as a threat to be dismissed, an attack from a minor competitor. His ego was the central gear in my entire machine. Then, our sharpest young analyst voiced the one fatal flaw. "Madeline, what if they find out you used to work there? They'll claim this entire submission is based on proprietary information you stole." The fear in the room was palpable. I felt a strange calm settle over me. "They won't dare mention my name," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "The moment Viridian files a protest that names me, they create a new legal obligation. The FDA will have to investigate my prior role. They will ask, what projects did Madeline Harper work on at Viridian? And Alastair Finch will be forced, under oath, to admit that I was the lead researcher who created the very safety protocols they are now being investigated for violating. Mentioning my name is not a defense. It's a confession. I had turned my own past into a shield. My greatest vulnerability was now my greatest strength. The submission deadline was 9 a.m. on a Friday. The morning air in the Ethelred office was still and heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. At 4:15 a.m., we uploaded our final submission, a single massive PDF file that contained 6 months of work and one carefully constructed time bomb. The hours that followed were a unique form of torment. I went to the small kitchen to make coffee, the ritual a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. My entire future, my 2 years of silent, patient planning, came down to this day. At precisely 9:01 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was an automated email from the FDA's submission portal. Subject, acknowledgement of submission. I opened it. It was just a standard confirmation receipt. My eyes scanned the text. And then I saw it. A line near the bottom, a piece of digital bureaucracy I had completely overlooked. Primary authoring credits, Madeline Harper, Ph.D., Research Integrity Protocol. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the polished concrete floor. I didn't feel the hot liquid splash across my shoes. All I felt was a sudden, sickening drop, like an elevator car whose cables had just been cut. My blood ran cold. Metadata, the document properties. In my obsessive focus on the content of the trap, I had forgotten the most elementary rule of digital warfare. I had forgotten to scrub my own name from the submission file's authorship details. My plan to remain a ghost, an anonymous architect of Viridian's downfall, had just evaporated. I had just signed my name to their death warrant. I had stepped out from behind the curtain and into the harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The quiet celebration in the office died down. Julian walked over, his face grim. He'd seen my name on the public filing. "Talk to me, Madeline," he said, his voice low. "What just happened?" I took a deep breath, and a strange, dark smile touched my lips. The fear was gone, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "The timeline has just been violently accelerated," I said, meeting his worried gaze. "But the outcome is the same. The element of surprise is gone, but the trap is still set. He knows it's me." The inevitable counterattack came not as a bullet, but as a quiet digital notification. A formal cease and desist letter from Viridian's legal team arrived via email, citing intellectual property theft. It was followed by a more personal message, an email sent directly from Alistair to my private account. It was 3 words: "You have no idea." The smug, condescending dismissal, the veiled threat. It wasn't an accusation, it was a taunt. He was telling me he saw me. He was telling me he knew what I was trying to do. And he was telling me he thought it was pathetic, a fly he was about to swat. The fury that rose in me was so hot it almost choked me. It burned away the last vestiges of panic, leaving behind a hard, cold resolve. My fingers, which had been trembling moments before, were now perfectly steady as I typed my reply. "Oh, I think I do." I hit send. The gauntlet had been thrown. "He thinks I'm a disgruntled ex-employee," I explained to Julian, pulling up a new directory on my computer. "He's going to file an official protest with the FDA's Scientific Advisory Board. He'll claim a fatal conflict of interest. He's trying to get us disqualified before they even read page 1 of our protocol." "Can he?" Julian asked, anxiety creeping back into his voice. "He's going to try," I said. I opened a password-protected folder on my secure drive. The folder was labeled Counter-Protest. "But he has no idea that this isn't a crisis. It's an opportunity. The fact that he's doing it now, blindly, based on my name alone, it's a gift." I swiveled my monitor so he could see. The folder contained a set of perfectly organized, clearly labeled PDF documents. Exhibit A, my original stability protocol memo. The metadata proved I wrote it. Exhibit B, the email chain where I formally warned him of the risks. And Exhibit C, the most important file, his digitally signed reply, his official directive, telling me my concerns were noted and dismissed. Alistair is about to submit a legal filing that officially and publicly links the name Madeline Harper to Viridian Dynamics, I explained. And the moment he does that, he gives me legal standing to respond. He thinks he's filing a protest against us. What he's actually doing is submitting a signed confession to the federal government. The official summons for a preliminary hearing before the FDA's Scientific Advisory Board arrived less than 48 hours later. The hearing room was on the 12th floor of a drab federal building, a space designed to intimidate through sheer blandness. On one side of the long mahogany table sat Julian and me with our outside counsel. On the other side, directly opposite me, sat Alistair Finch. He met my gaze across the table, and for a fleeting second, his mask of professional concern slipped. I saw a flash of pure, venomous triumph. He believed he had already won. His lawyer, a smooth, polished man who billed $1,000 an hour, laid out their case with practiced gravity. He spoke of ethical walls, of fiduciary duty, of corporate espionage. He never said my name, referring to me only as the individual in question. When he was finished, the chairperson, a stern-looking official named Dr. Anya Sharma, looked at me. "Dr. Harper," she said, her voice cutting through the legal jargon. "The protest filing centers on you. Would you care to respond?" Before our lawyer could speak, I leaned forward. "I would, ma'am." Across the table, Alistair leaned into his own microphone, unable to resist delivering the killing blow himself. His voice was calm and measured. "Dr. Sharma, members of the board, this is a deeply uncomfortable situation. To clarify for the record," he said, turning to look directly at me. "Dr. Harper, you were an employee at Viridian Dynamics, working directly under my supervision on the early stages of the AD-117 project. Is that correct?" Checkmate. That was the look on his face. He had forced me to admit the very connection that formed the basis of his protest. "Yes, Dr. Finch, that is correct," I said, my voice clear and steady. Then I delivered the counterpunch I had been preparing for 2 years. "And my employment with Viridian ended shortly after I formally documented a significant protocol breach. where I discovered that key long-term safety data related to what is now known as Section 4B had been improperly, and, in my opinion, unethically truncated by a senior executive. The air went out of the room. I saw a flicker of confusion, then alarm in Alastair's eyes. This was not in his script. Dr. Sharma's weary expression was gone, replaced by one of sharp, focused interest. Dr. Harper, that is a very serious allegation. Do you have any evidence to substantiate this claim? This was the moment, the culmination of 730 days of silence. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the slim black hard drive. I placed it gently on the polished table. "I do, ma'am," I said. "Everything is on this drive. With your permission, I can display the relevant documents on the monitor." Dr. Sharma nodded. I walked to the large screen at the end of the room, inserted the drive, and clicked open the first file. "Exhibit B," I announced. An email chain. In this chain, I outlined to Dr. Finch my scientific opinion that cutting the stability study short creates an unacceptable risk of unidentified long-term degradants. I scrolled down slowly. Then I clicked back. And Exhibit C, this is Dr. Finch's final, digitally signed reply to that chain. There, on the 60-inch screen for the entire room to see, was Alastair's email. The text was terse, dismissive. It thanked me for my overly cautious analysis and contained the damning final sentence: "Proceed with the expedited timeline. This matter is closed." And below the text, clear as day, was his full, digitally certified signature block. I turned back to the table. Every single person in the room was staring at Alastair Finch. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving a pale, waxy mask. His lawyer was looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He had clearly been lied to. Dr. Sharma took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice cold steel, "this board is deeply troubled by what we have just seen. This suggests that not only is your protest without merit, but that your firm may have intentionally submitted an application to the FDA with a deliberately misleading and incomplete safety profile regarding Section 4B. If that is found to be the case, not only will your protest be summarily dismissed, but Viridian Dynamics will almost certainly be subject to a full clinical hold and potentially barred from future submissions pending a full investigation into your firm's research practices." The verdict was delivered. The execution was complete. I walked back to my seat and collected the hard drive. The hearing was over. As we walked out of the federal building, the fallout began. A formal notice was posted to the FDA's public portal. Viridian Dynamics has been requested to provide a supplemental explanation regarding their stability data protocols. To the outside world, it was jargon. To the industry, it was a public death sentence. The Wall Street Journal picked up the story. The article was brutal in its detached reporting, citing significant scrutiny over bidding practices and questions regarding compliance with stringent safety regulations. Viridian's sterling reputation for invincible competence was shattered. Alastair was forced to resign. His LinkedIn profile, once a monument to his achievements, was changed to a stark, pathetic line: "Independent scientist." The final presentation before the FDA felt like a coronation. Viridian went first. Alastair was there, a ghost at his own hanging, forced by his board to see the failure through to its humiliating end. Then it was our turn. Julian laid out our vision. Then he introduced me. I walked to the lectern. I looked across the room at the woman who had replaced Alastair, then let my gaze travel to where he sat with his defeated team. I leaned into the microphone. "Good morning," I said. "In this presentation, we will discuss the foundational principle of our firm, character." My presentation was about the philosophy of public trust. I framed the dense language of the FDA regulations not as hurdles to be cleared, but as a moral covenant. Finally, I reached my conclusion. "It is the standard to which we hold ourselves," I said, clicking the remote for the projector. The complex diagrams on the massive screen behind me vanished. They were replaced by a stark white background. In the center, in a large, black, authoritative font, were 6 words. The exact phrase from my original memo, the one he had personally deleted and told me to bury. "Data integrity is non-negotiable." Absolute, deafening silence fell over the room. The verdict was undeniable. 3 days later, the official email arrived. Following a comprehensive review, the fast-track designation is hereby awarded to Ethelred Therapeutics. The office erupted. I remained in my chair, a small smile on my face. At the bottom of the email, on the line for the project's lead scientist, was my name. Later that day, a final email from Alistair arrived. The bitter acid of a defeated king dripped from every word. You destroyed all of this just to get revenge on me. My fingers moved over the keyboard. My reply was short, precise, and contained the entire truth of the last 2 years. No, I built it so you would remember the truth. I hit send, then blocked his address. 6 months passed. The New York Times ran a feature on Ethelred, calling our approach a new paradigm in ethical drug development. I was walking back from a lunch meeting when I found myself across the street from the old Viridian Dynamics building. The grand steel letters that had once spelled out the company's name were gone, leaving only a ghostly outline on the marble. A team of workers was methodically erasing the last evidence that the giant had ever lived there. I hadn't dismantled a project. I had dismantled an empire. A sudden gust of wind whipped down the urban canyon. It caught a loose piece of debris from the demolition, a shard of curved glass from the old logo, and sent it clattering onto the sidewalk near my feet. On pure instinct, I bent down and picked it up. It was cold and surprisingly heavy. A trophy, a piece of the fallen enemy. I could take it, put it on my desk, a silent reminder of my victory. I stared at it for a long, silent moment. I saw Alistair's face, felt the shame of that final walk through the lobby, the weight of 2 years of fury. And then I felt nothing. It was just a piece of scrap, a relic from a dead and buried past. Keeping it wouldn't add to my victory, it would only chain me to the memory of the fight. I walked over to a large public recycling bin on the corner and gently placed the glass shard into the slot for glass. The fight was over. As I straightened up, my phone vibrated. A text from a senior official at the FDA. Congratulations on the Times feature. Well deserved. The past was being recycled. The future was in my hand. I turned and walked away, the sound of the city rising up around me. I did not look back. Alistair tried to erase my name from a single scientific paper. In the end, I rewrote the ethical standards for an entire industry.